Spiritual Unfoldment. Part 4. Spiritual Unfoldment. The gradual development or revelation of the spiritual. Spiritual retardment. Lack of spiritual unfoldment. As to the appearances in the earth, not all of these may be given. For these ye attain in thy varied cycles of unfoldment. As indicated in the first promise to man, in his relationship to the creative forces, honor thy father, thy mother that thy days may be long in the land. Think not that it stops there. The longer there has been the proper use of thy abilities, the greater has been there may be opportunities for the glorifying of God, and ye find that with what measure ye meet to others mentally, spiritually, physically it is measured back to thee. These are well in their place, but they lead to that which is indicated in the figure in the right upper corner, in this life seal. For this is the culmination of God's approach to man in his phase of unfoldment in the earth. Thus as he expressed himself, it was not merely an individual entity, but his son, his chosen son, as with the great teachers of the earth. For even in Elijah or John we find the faltering, the doubting. We find no faltering, no doubting, no putting aside of the purpose in the Master Jesus. Before that the entity was in the Holy Land, during those periods when there were those centers established where the collection of customs was to be carried on. The entity was of those peoples being taxed, that sought and obtained and acted in the capacity of a collector of customs, the abilities to make monies, to be the politician, to be the smooth talker. Whether these are used for material, mental or spiritual unfoldment, come from those experiences of the entity when it came in close associations with activities during that sojourn. 4. The entity is indeed an Atlantean. And, as just indicated, there may be those suppressions or those unfoldments that may make or cause the use of those tenets and truths that were a part of the experience of many through those periods, that may bring the unusual usage of spiritual and mental laws and the experiences of those with whom the entity may come in contact. In the unfoldments we will find psychic forces of unusual natures manifesting in the experience. Not only may the body learn or teach much pertaining to levitation, but also there are the abilities to translate much that has not been interpreted in the experiences of but few thus far in the material plane. Before that the entity was in the Holy Land, during those periods when there were the settlings in the land of those peoples of promise from the Egyptian land. The entity was among the Hittites who were to be driven out of the land, yet the entity made agreements with the leader of that land and thus saved himself, as it were, for the moment, as well as his peoples, but in a deceitful manner, which has continued to be as a canker within the soul or the heart of the individual itself. For, as aptly said, what a fatal web we weave when we first practice to deceive. He that deceives his fellow man, in whatever way or manner, brings the great distress, great disturbance, within his own soul. For, with what purpose ye sow, it is with that purpose ye reap. The entity materially and mentally gained, and eventually gained, in the spiritual application and unfoldment. Yes, we have the body here, 31:14. As we find, these, for this experience of the body, are rather serious. If it will be accepted, this is a purging of the body, thus a prenatal condition, or a choice by the entity to enter this particular environment. Yet those making administrations for helpfulness for this body may change the whole course of this entity's unfoldment. First, there is the necessity of getting the cooperation of the body itself, so that there may be those impressions made upon creative influences in the body. This will require spiritual awakening, mental alertness. And the body has grown so don't care in some respects that this will require some effort on the part of those responsible for the body. While there may be developments, and while there may be helpful influences, so that there may be the ability to use self, and parts of the locomotories may be helped, we find that this will require long, tedious applications. For, the ability of the reflexes to produce coordination between the physical being and the mental being will be the greater problems to solve as the body physically develops. If the physical does develop, as well as the ability of the mental body to remain in control constantly of the physical body. Thus, from some, there might be the impressions that such should not be allowed to develop and become ever as a charge to others. Yet, these, too, are necessary in the experience of man as he approaches the applications of the tenets of creative energies, or truth in his experience. For, to the measure that an individual entity applies itself for helpful physical, mental or spiritual unfoldment, so does that body do to its maker. Please note. In a soul's lifetime on Earth, each cycle lasts around 7 years. For example, cycle 1. 1 to 7 years old. Cycle 2. 7 to 14 years old, etc. In giving the interpretations of the records as we find them here, as much of the present period of unfoldment might be directed to those who are responsible for this unfoldment in the material life. And as the entity begins the second cycle, it is not too early to begin those promptings that may lead to the fulfilling of those purposes for which the entity came into this experience. These, then, we choose from the records of the entity with the desire and purpose that this information may be helpful for the entity, thus enabling the entity to better fulfill those purposes in the earth. In analyzing self, first know what is thy ideal. This is necessary if there would be unfoldment or development, spiritually, mentally, materially. For there is the body, the mind and the soul, and that which comes into mind is first of spirit, and that which the mind dwells upon it acts upon or refrains from, but the action brings material manifestations in material conditions. Thus may the entity, as any entity, control the urges that grow or are dismissed in the experience. Do not entertain that which is not in line or in keeping with the spiritual, mental and material ideal. Before that was in the Egyptian land during those periods when there were the preparations for the activities from the temple beautiful, and especially in association with those that held for the establishing of homes as individual units. The entity was close in activity with the priest, as well as with many of those that held to that phase of man's unfoldment during those periods of activity there. The appearances in the earth have been quite varied, but very far apart, thus quite a variation as to the latent and manifested urges that arise in the emotions of the body. For, the body is emotional, and yet the abilities to control same have been and are a part of the unfoldment or the development of a consciousness, the awareness of universal consciousness through the activities necessary. In giving an interpretation of the records for this entity, while, even in this experience, much of the activities have passed, there may still be an unusual application in a beneficial manner that will not only add to the mental and spiritual unfoldment, but also aid in every way, thus making life more worthwhile for this entity. While all the appearances may not be given, these we find have an influence in the experience through the next two cycles of the entity's unfoldment, or in those periods of preparation the entity would make for its place among its fellow men. And let this ever be the purpose. The place where thou art, the corner in which ye may shine, may it ever be better for your being in it. Give something of self rather than demanding of others. Contribute to the welfare of thine own household, thine own community, thine own school, thine own state, thine own nation. All is relative, and as you apply self in these various phases of the experience, you will find self and the abilities of self unfolding. Activities as related to religious studies should be a part of the entity's activity. The entity will have a great imagination. Encourage rather than discourage it or making fun of same. The entity will be gifted especially in writing of the fictional nature pertaining to historical places. Hence in the early developing, early history or stories of historical characters should be made to be the heroes for the entity. Rather than war heroes, let them be reformers, or those given to special unfoldment as Edison, or such character who have aided or contributed to the welfare of man's unfoldments, such as Fulton or Whitney, or those of that character, rather than war heroes. In analyzing urges astrologically, we find Venus, Jupiter, Mercury as the ruling forces in the entity's experience. Hence the constant seeking for love and its manifestation, its beauties, its sorrows, its sadnesses. For many an individual entity, those things that are of sorrow are the greater helps for unfoldment, as the entity has experienced in some of its disappointments. Thus apply self in the more universal manner as indicated in Jupiter, and through love in its proper distribution, in its proper emphasis in the life of the young, and there may come the greater joy and help. Never as the meddler, but, as indicated, so act towards the young that with the least opportunity they will be about thee, seeking what thou hast to give of an awakening to their relationships to creative forces or God. We find in Jupiter the desire ever to make those expressions to the glorification of one cause or one purpose, yet reservations are oft the order of the day with the mental self. These must be submerged if there would be the unfoldment that may bring the entity those opportunities and privileges to make manifest the love of God towards the children of men in many ways. Venus, Jupiter, and again Venus, with Saturn, are the greater forces. Hence music, beauty, joy, harmony, even song, should be a part of the unfoldment. Learn sorrow, learn joy, but let that expressed in "I walked in the garden with Jesus" be as the light in thy composition of song, yea, in thy melody upon the musical instrument in which he may give voice. Practice the more upon the organ. Let that be a means or way of expression, as well as upon the piano. For, in those activities it aided others, and others ever should be the watchword for each and every soul. For the soul enters not by chance but for the unfoldment of a growth, of an activity. Let thy words be well spoken of, but let thy hopes, the emphasis of thy promises, the emphasis of thy expectancy, be ever one with that creative force that brings all into manifestation. One fair of face and body, one that may find its greater activities in its work with children, the means for greater unfoldment. For these, as ye will find, are not self-conscious, neither are they a respecter of people's feelings, nor do they become politique. But they forgive easily. It would be well to pattern after that as has been given, unless ye become as little children you will in no wise enter in. In the present there are the abilities of the entity to contribute to the welfare and the unfoldment of minds of the young. In and through this may the entity find the greater expressions, the greater abilities, the greater release of self in the present experience. Then as one that would be a tutor, a companion, a maid, a helper to the young, would be the activities in the present in which training may be given. In the use or preparation for the caring of those who are under the entity, in the care of the body, the household, the preparations for any physical or material activity that others should or would choose for their experiences. In interpreting the records as we find here, it is well to consider the experiences of the entity in the realm of the mental and spiritual forces, as may be indicated, or the sojourns in the earth, not as passing judgments. For, judgment is of the Lord, and not the condemning of any of those experiences, or the manner in which the entity has applied or used its opportunities in the present or in the past. That the entity comes seeking indicates that it is of the house of Israel, and, seeking, there may indeed come that answer which will enable the entity to use this present experience as a stepping stone for the unfoldment of a greater experience, and walk with the consciousness of the spiritual life. There will be found the ability to write of the activities of mind for unfoldments of the perception of the sense forces of the body, whether these be for exotic activities or for spiritual incantations, or for the soothing of the mind, those things that would fire the imagination of youth. Yes, these may be a part of the experience, and those things that would bring comfort and quietude to those in trouble. In giving an interpretation of the records here, these we would choose with the desire and purpose that this be a helpful experience for the entity, enabling it to better fulfill those purposes for which it entered this material sojourn. While there are faults, there are virtues, we would magnify the virtues and minimize the faults. The application of self to the urges latent and manifested makes for the unfoldment or development in this material plane. Never become weary in well-doing. But not for self and not for any cause save that which is impelled through the way and the truth and the light, or the Christ consciousness.